Willie Somerset was an FBI informant who lied for money, Dr. Edward Fields wrote in a recent letter to me. Edward Fields founded the National States Rights Party in 1958. He's now 92, and he continues to produce literature promoting white supremacy. He occasionally sends me his latest pamphlets. Dr. Fields would have good reason to blast Willie Somerset. As an informant for both the FBI since 1949 and the Miami Police Intelligence Department since 1962, Willie Somerset knew most of Edward Fields' associates. He was a Ku Klux Klan insider. He was also a National States Rights Party member. In fact, Miami supporters of the white supremacist party planned to murder Willie Somerset. Somerset's name and reputation, author Jeffrey Caufield called Somerset, quote, an unsung hero in his efforts against the terrorist campaign of racial violence in the South in the 1950s and 60s, has endured a number of ad hominems in the JFK research community. Nobody seems to know how to handle the information provided by Willie Augusts Somersett, who died in 1970 in North Carolina. But it is thanks to Somerset we have the recording of Georgian Klansman Joseph Milteer boasting of what appears to be the cover story for the actual assassination of JFK, that he would be shot from an office building with a high-powered rifle, and the murder would be quickly pinned on an unsuspecting fall guy. When Milteer made this statement, which Somerset recorded, we it was 2 weeks before the president was gunned down in Dallas. Also, two investigators of stellar repute, former Miami intelligence detective Everett Kay, who worked with Somerset directly, and FBI Special Agent Don Adams, both found Somerset credible. Consider that on April 3rd, 1968, Somerset called Miami Police Lieutenant Charles Sapp to inform him that the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King was going to be shot. And the next day, King was killed at the Lorraine Motel in Memphis, Tennessee. What's both interesting and eerie is that in the latest National States Rights Party literature sent to me by Dr. Fields from August 2024, he profiles J.B. Stoner, calling him a patriot for supporting segregation. Stoner, a Klansman and lawyer, represented James Earl Ray and was suspected by the FBI of personally being involved in the MLK assassination. So Milteer not only knew about how the assassination of JFK would be sold to the public, he gave names to Willie Somerset on who did the actual killing. It was the next day, November 23rd, and Somerset and Milteer were on their way to a Klan meeting in South Carolina. Somerset was careful not to probe too much to arouse suspicion. Milteer was happy, but did not dwell on the events that transpired in Dealey Plaza. He was already focused on the next stage of the plot. He did, however, name three names associated with the hit. Dallas police officer J.D. Tippit, who was killed ostensibly by Oswald shortly after the president was in the Oak Cliff section of Dallas. Second name, Reverend Theodore R. Jackman. Third name, Reverend Dr. Roy E. Davis. These were the names, per Willie Somerset, from Joseph Milteer on who was responsible in the kill zone in Dealey Plaza on November 22nd, 1963. It boggles my mind that this information has not been seriously or thoroughly checked out by 99% of the JFK researchers. I hope that when the dust finally settles after all these decades, the D class vindicates the claims of Willie Augusts Somerset. Because if one takes this info at face value and explores who exactly these individuals were, two things become apparent. One, the Rosetta Stone of the assassination rests at the scene of the murder of J.D. Tippit. And two, the Ku Klux Klan was far more involved in the assassination than most conspiracy theorists or the general public readily acknowledge. I will argue in this video that a faction of right-wing extremists, Klansmen, Pentecostal healing revivalists, pro-segregation Southern Catholics who identified with Christian identity and who opposed Catholic JFK, both for his civil rights policy and his disarmament policy, plotted to kill the president as a statement. In his book, America's Secret Jihad, The Hidden History of Religious Terrorism in the United States, Stuart Wexler writes of a quote, network of religious terrorists that developed cross affiliations and methods of communication that inspired horrible acts of violence. This video will show that indeed the JFK assassination was an act carried out by religious extremists, Christian identity terrorists, men who were brazen and confident enough because they had a military bulwark to protect them, specifically the retired generals and colonels who were veterans of General MacArthur's staff during World War II. Okay, the timeline of the J.D. Tippit killing. The president was shot at 12:30 p.m. At about 1 o'clock p.m., Lee Harvey Oswald, 24 years old, left work at the Texas School Book Depository. He arrived at his boarding house in the Oak Cliff neighborhood of Dallas, 1026 North Beckley. He changed his shirt and was only there for less than 5 minutes. The housekeeper, Elaine Roberts, said, "Oh, you were in a hurry," and Oswald ignored her. Roberts testified a police car pulled up to the house during this time of Oswald being home or being at this boarding house. The driver gave two quick honks on the car horn. And it's important to note that Oswald was registered at this boarding house as O.H. Lee, and only his wife Marina and Mrs. Ruth Payne knew the address. So why would a police vehicle be tooting its horn outside a rooming house, the same rooming house of the purported assassin of the President of the United States? 9/10 of a mile from 1026 North Beckley, Oswald was allegedly spotted on foot at 10th and Patton in Oak Cliff. Moments later, Officer Tippit is gunned down outside his vehicle at this intersection, shot 4 times. The assailant, supposedly Oswald, flees the scene, ducking behind a Texaco service station. Dallas police later put out a dispatch that the suspect was seen fleeing down an alley behind the Texaco station to the door of a church, the Abundant Life Temple, located at 10th and Crawford. The investigators for Jim Garrison, DA of New Orleans, looked into who ran that church, suspecting it served as a kind of safe house of some kind of prearranged safe house. Eric Tagg, writing in Brush with History, put it this way. The Abundant Life Temple takes us into a labyrinth from which we might never reemerge, so we must hold to the surface as much as possible. The New Orleans DA investigators traced the incorporators of the church to something called United Missions of America in an apparent effort to try to find some connection to Jack Ruby, but nothing seems to have developed from that angle. Now, I personally spoke with Rod Sherrill, son of one of the incorporators of this United Missions of America, the late George Sherrill. The topic in my conversation was about the Pentecostal healing preacher who ran that church at the time of the assassination, Reverend Oscar B. or O.B. Graham. What Sherrill revealed does indeed take us into a labyrinth we may never reemerge, though even Tagg may not have suspected how dark it would get. The labyrinth of Christian identity, white supremacy, and ultimately the KKK. O.B. Graham and the Abundant Temple of Doom. O.B. Graham purchased the church building in Oak Cliff in April of 1962. In 1964, he sold that building, this Abundant Life Temple building, and he appeared to alternate his time between Dallas and Tulsa. He also visited Moscow in 1964, and he died in 1974. He was 53 years old. It's an interesting coincidence that both Graham's church, the Abundant Life Temple, and the Texas School Book Depository Company only recently moved into their respective physical buildings in the months leading up to the assassinations. So in Dealey Plaza, the book depository had been just across the street at 501 Elm on the first floor of the Dow Tex building. In 1962, Graham's Abundant Life Center relocated from 2 miles south at 1730 South Ewing, which is still a church today, Lighthouse Gospel Center. And it's interesting that both buildings were owned by men affiliated with the Civil Air Patrol. D.H. Byrd, co-founder and Texas Wing Commander, owned the Texas School Book Depository. Obie Graham was a former South Carolina Civil Air Patrol chaplain, and he was nicknamed the Flying Evangelist because of his piloting ability. So you have the accused assassin of both JFK, killed outside the Texas School Book Depository, and Officer J.D. Tippit, killed outside the Abundant Life Temple, was former Civil Air Patrol cadet Lee Harvey Oswald. Now, I would love to know where exactly was Obie Graham on November 22nd and who let this purported Tippit assailant into the back of the Abundant Life Church, and how did that assailant fleeing know that that door would be unlocked? What's further striking, though, is that Graham and the Abundant Life Temple follow full gospel Pentecostalism that emphasizes divine healing. And this is curious because Willie Somerset's other names that he provided, Theodore R. Jackman and R.E. Davis, both reverends, are both connected to this full gospel tradition. Jackman, as one of the first preachers in Amy Semple McPherson's Foursquare Church in LA, and R.E. Davis as a well-known healing minister known for his tent revivals. Now, still more, this is sort of ancillary, but nonetheless interesting that according to the Warren Commission document 693, preacher John Howard Bowen, who repeatedly sat next to Oswald or someone impersonating him on Oswald's bus ride into Mexico City in September 1963, was himself a representative of the Full Gospel Church. Then this was provided by Bessie White, who was donating to Bowen's missionary activity in Mexico. Rod Sherrill, in his phone interview with me, revealed that his father, George Sherrill, was Obie Graham's biggest supporter. Graham even made George Sherrill a deacon. But Sherrill broke with Graham when Graham partnered with a healing revivalist pastor named O.L. Jaggers in 1962 or 1963. This was coming directly from Rod, Sherrill's son, to me. So Sherrill, according to the Sun, didn't approve of the influence Jaggers brought in on Graham and the Graham Church. So, does the Jaggers angle open up any new doors? But before we get into any more on this O.L. Jaggers fellow, let's establish the connection of the Ku Klux Klan through R.E. Davis, Roy E. Davis. Not only were Theodore Jackman and R.E. Davis Pentecostal ministers of questionable repute, they were both linked to the KKK. Davis was long linked to the Klan. He was Imperial Dragon of the Dallas KKK and a seasoned recruiter for the Klan. According to a congressional report, Davis reactivated the Klan in Louisiana in 1960. Davis himself told the Shreveport Times that he was one of the 15 men who resurrected the Klan in 1915 on Stone Mountain in Georgia. As author John Collins noted in his book, Preacher Behind the White Hoods, Davis and a congressman from Georgia, William Upshaw, were, quote, using their evangelism to promote Ku Klux Klan agenda, and the Klan published newsletters painted them as heroes. And still more. This is John Collins writing. Davis testified that he was present when the Constitution and laws of the KKK were written. The Klan promoted themselves as a Christian organization, end quote. At about this same time, about 1921, while Davis was preaching Klan values like white supremacy, holding Klan rallies in his church, he put out a church newsletter called The Progress. Davis used the progress to spout anti-Catholic conspiracy theories. Animosity was especially geared towards Blacks, Jews, Catholics, and anyone born outside the U.S. Decades later, in 1955, R.E. Davis ministered the first service at a new Church of Christ at the Odd Fellows Hall, less than a mile from where J.D. Tippit was gunned down 8 years later. We'll see later that R.E. Davis and his wife are Dallas residents, not too far from where all this transpired. In 1958, Davis spoke at the Adolphus Hotel in Dallas to the Oak Cliff Indignant White Citizens Council about school integration. This is his quote. I would rather die or be put in prison than allow Negro children be integrated with white children in Dallas white schools. Now, the 1954 Supreme Court decision, Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, deemed segregation in public schools unconstitutional. And while this is happening in Dallas, in Louisiana, Guy Bannister was deeply bonded with the greater New Orleans chapter of this White Citizens Council. In early 1961, Davis was cited again in the Shreveport Times as, quote, the nation's top Klan man. Davis told the Louisiana newspaper the Klan's main goals were, quote, states' rights, constitutional government, and white supremacy. Davis, as we pointed out, was a recruiter for the Klan, and he is in Louisiana on a recruiting mission at this time. And it corresponds, interestingly, with Guy Bannister supposedly undertaking similar recruiting efforts of Mississippi Klansmen in the summer of 1963. John Collins again. In declassified FBI documents, it becomes clear that Roy Davis was already being tracked by the federal government, and when John F. Kennedy was elected president, this would have made Roy Davis a classified public enemy of the state. Wanted for treason. The day before the president's death, handbills circulated around Dallas. The president was wanted for treason. Nazi supporter Robert Surrey, aide to disgruntled right-wing former General Edwin Walker, whom Oswald purportedly took a shot at 7 months before JFK's hit, printed and circulated these flyers. There was another individual associated with the production of these handbills, none other than Roy E. Davis. There was an employee at Lettercraft Printers. His name was Robert Klaus. Said the person for whom he made the film negative of the wanted for treason leaflet looked like, quote, Lee Harvey Oswald in a wig. Again, from quoting John Collins here, the printing presses for this leaflet were traced to printing equipment borrowed by Roy E. Davis from one Earl Thornton. Thornton and Davis were suspected by a member of the Dallas PD Intelligence Unit and investigator Brumley. And Brumley also suspected another individual was involved in this leaflet issue, production distribution, a Jimmy George Robinson, who was an organizer of Dr. Fields's National States Rights Party. We'll be touching more on this very important issue of the leaflets soon. Okay, so R.E. Davis's acolyte, the prophet, William Branham, whom Davis baptized, and in many ways was Branham's puppet, took aim at the policies of President Kennedy, particularly regarding civil rights. John Collins has written this wonderful book chronicling all of this, and I think it's worth quoting Collins in full. He writes, almost 90% of the African American population of Texas was on the eastern side near Dallas. When Dallas was ordered to integrate on January 27, 1958, as the battle against integration was exploding, Davis was elected president of the White Supremacy Council to lead the opposition. Interestingly, this was the same time Branham held campaigns in the Dallas-Fort Worth area. It was also one of the campaigns in which William Branham sold his slave story describing African Americans as aliens. John Collins grew up in Branham's church, and he detailed a number of attacks from Branham on the sitting president. Branham said JFK broke the Constitution by activating the National Guard to enforce desegregation. Branham supported the efforts of the indignant White Citizens Council. Branham compared MLK to Hitler. Branham said JFK's equal rights stance was denial of freedom of religion. Branham said JFK was the Antichrist and the Pharaoh of Egypt because the, quote, Exodus is at hand. And Branham said supporters of JFK were to be excommunicated from the word. Branham also said that after the election in 1960, one of the greatest mistakes, this is Branham's direct quote, one of the greatest mistakes of the colored race ever made was down in Louisiana and over in there when they voted for Kennedy the other night and put him in. Collins detects this rhetoric change in Branham. The assault started when Kennedy ran for office, and this corresponded. This is 1960 with R.E. Davis, who's essentially Branham's mentor, rebirthing the KKK. Now, both Branham and Davis promoted this Klan concept of a true or pure Americanism. This can be defined by the questions of a Klan application from the 1920s. Here are some samples. Were your parents born in the United States of America? Are you a Gentile or Jew? Are you of the white race or colored race? Do you believe in white supremacy? What is your religious faith? Of what religious faith are your parents? Do you owe any kind of allegiance to any foreign nation, government, institution, sect, people, ruler, or person? Now, pure Americanism, in my mind, can be neatly summed up here. This is from the film Mississippi Burning, 1988, wherein the local Klan leader is confronted by a newspaperman. Take a look.
Your name, please? Clayton Townley, local businessman. Are you, sir, a spokesman for the White Knights of the Ku Klux Klan? I told you, I'm a businessman. I'm also a Mississippian and an American. And I am getting sick and tired of the way many of us Mississippians are having our views distorted by you newspaper people and on the TV. So let's get this straight. We do not accept Jews because they reject Christ. And their control of the international banking cartels are at the root of what we call communism today. We do not accept papists because they bow to a Roman dictator. We do not accept Turks, Mongols, Tartars, Orientals, nor Negroes because we're here to protect Anglo-Saxon democracy and the American way. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, true Americanism was reflected in William Branham's serpent seed theology, preaching that intercourse between Eve and the serpent resulted in Cain, inferior brother, and murderer to Adam and Eve's son Abel. The colored race, then, are the offspring of Cain, according to William Branham. John Collins discussed this at length in Preacher Behind the White Hoods. Branham originally advocated a biblical single bloodline beginning with Adam, claiming as late as 1956 that skin tone came from sun exposure, not from a separate bloodline. But as desegregation loomed and became a true reality in the U.S., Branham called out the race mixing as communistic. Collins concluded that while he was not yet publicly identified with R.E. Davis, William Branham was saying exactly what Roy Davis and other white supremacists wanted him to say. This serpent seed doctrine is the foundation of Christian identity theology. That is, the real Jews are Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, Nordic, and Aryan whites, the true descendants of the lost tribes of Israel, and therefore Jesus was also white. In awe of the prophet William Branham, and his message was a young man who wanted to emulate his idol. His name was O.L. Jaggers, the same O.L. Jaggers who will team up with O.B. Graham, much to the consternation of George Sherrill, as told to me by his son Rod. And here we can establish our own Foursquare connection, purported shooter of JFK, R.E. Davis, to healing preacher William Branham, to O.L. Jaggers, to O.B. Graham, and the Abundant Life Temple. Also, at this exact same time, an inferior bloodline was being preached in the sermons of another Pentecostal trained preacher, Reverend Wesley Swift. Swift was a student at Aimee Semple McPherson's Life Bible College of Angeles Temple in LA. in the early 1930s when Reverend Theodore R. Jackman taught there. Swift was not only a member of the Klan, but he was a rifle instructor for it. And, I think it bears mention that the Klan even had its own intelligence organization. Wesley Swift is generally regarded as the chief proponent of Christian identity in the United States. To Swift, if white people were the real chosen people, black people arrived on the planet by way of a space fleet organized by Lucifer. This might seem totally outlandish, but consider the prominence of UFOs at this time within not only the sermons of these preachers, but also the Guy Bannister operation in New Orleans. And throughout the cover up of the assassination, Colonel Philip Corso was the source of the rumor that Lee Oswald was a paid FBI informant. And just before his death in 1998, Corso published the purported nonfiction memoir, The Day After Roswell, with a foreword by Senator Strom Thurmond. Why were UFOs such a strangely common topic? Well, according to R.E. Davis Klan collaborator William Upshaw, congressman, who's quoted in the Klan newspaper, The Fiery Cross, 39 million persons in the United States had alien, parenthetical, un-American thought. And again, I'm gonna quote John Collins here, who wrote, white supremacy groups claimed that allowing African Americans in white schools, jobs, and marriages was un-American, and therefore promoted their agendas as Americanism. Swift and William Branham both ideologically point to a Louisiana preacher, Gerald L.K. Smith, whose Christian nationalist crusade promoted rhetoric from the protocols of the Elders of Zion. Smith founded a party, America First, from 1943 to 1947, with its main priority to preserve America as a Christian nation. At this point in history, communism was the great enemy to loyal, patriotic Americans, right? People like J. Edgar Hoover and his FBI. That version of the FBI was far more willing to turn a blind eye to white supremacists than it was to potential Reds on American shores. I think this is a wonderful quote. It's from Luke Molgeson from The Storm Is Here. White vigilantes had cloaked their identity-based violence in the ideological guise of anti-communism for decades. This was true for our purposes in Guy Bannister's detective agency in New Orleans. Recall, Bannister was a career officer of the law. He was a longtime FBI man, and at the time of the Kennedy assassination, he was running Guy Bannister and Associates in New Orleans. He seemed particularly adept at investigating and exposing leftist subversive groups. But Bannister's secretary at this detective agency and his mistress, Delphine Roberts, was a vocal New Orleans Catholic who was excommunicated by the church because she opposed the official school integration policies of the Archdiocese of New Orleans. And in Delphine Roberts, we get a very clear sense of the ideology that was most likely permeating the office and the person she worked for, Guy Bannister. Roberts frequently promoted her British Israelism ideology in letters to the editor and sign picketing. So she once picketed outside a church holding a sign, Jesus was born of the house of David, of pure white stock in Judea, a white country. It is our sacred duty to preserve the white race of Jesus. It's interesting to note that excommunicated with Delphine Roberts in New Orleans was Judge Leander Perez and Jackson Mercado. Willie Somerset said Leander Perez was a financial backer of the JFK assassination. Actually, this is from James Dickerson's Dixie's Little Secret, How the Government, the Media, and the Mob Reshaped the Modern Republican Party into the Image of the Old Confederacy. Leander Perez backed the Federation for Constitutional Government, which was an alliance of Southern states that were pro-segregation. Moreover, and this was according to Jeff Caufield here, Perez was close to both Guy Bannister, and Joseph Milteer. Still more, Leander Perez defended then Governor Huey Long during Long's 1929 impeachment. Just a few years before this is telling. Just before his rise to power, Long is a lawyer in northern Louisiana. He defended none other than the Bannister family in a wrongful death suit against the city of Monroe following the death of Guy Bannister's 12-year-old brother, Troy, who was electrocuted in 1925. Perez was present when Huey Long was assassinated in 1935. With Perez and Huey Long on that day was Gerald L.K. Smith, who I mentioned above. Smith's biographer, Glenn Gianson, writing in a 1994 issue of Louisiana History, called Smith and Perez Long henchmen and Huey Long henchmen and loyalists. The biographer writes, Long's principal scapegoats was the rich, Smith's Jews, Perez's blacks. They used religion as a political weapon and brandished the Bible for political effect.
The man who might have mobilized the lunatic fringe into a real political army, the late Huey P. Long.
One man, one gun, one bullet. That's what they said it'd take to stop you. But Huey?
Exhorting the lunatic fringe today is one of Huey Long's henchmen, who little more than a year ago was unknown outside the red clay parishes of Louisiana.
Oh, are you the Gerald Smith from Louisiana?
No, just Gerald Smith from everywhere.
After Huey Long's assassination, wherein Gerald L.K. Smith gave the eulogy, Smith goes to Detroit and he befriends Henry Ford, and Smith founds a publication called The Cross and the Flag in 1942. Smith never himself attained political office, and he tried many times, including a presidential run in 1944 for something called the Christian Nationalist Party. This brings me back to this Protocols of the Elders of Zion. It's a forged document alleging a long-standing Jewish conspiracy to achieve global domination, the hidden hand of international Zionism, and its plan to gain global control through the elimination of the Christian church. Henry Ford promoted it and even launched his own detective agency to root out the global plans of the international Jew. Now, in the same circles promoting the Protocols of the Elders of Zion is Reverend Dr. Theodore Roosevelt Jackman, a, quote, violent associate of Joseph Milteer, per Willie Somerset, who called Jackman one of the toughest killers. Jackman, who in newspaper articles does not appear to be one of the toughest killers, fronted as an expert in Palestinian archaeology and antiquities. He's a representative of the World Christian Fundamentals who supported anti-evolution and blamed the Palestinian problem on the UN and Arab chiefs. Jackman took speaking gigs for the John Birch Society and addressed groups like the Young American for Freedom and Daughters of the Confederacy. He was spending the early 1960s advocating against the Kennedy plan for nuclear disarmament. He would be, like Delphine Roberts, he would be writing op-eds into newspapers. As the Cuban Missile Crisis unfolded, he's advocating for national defense. In Danville, last capital of the Confederate States of America, he talked heraldry. He seemed to tie his speeches to some kind of yearning for royal elite. He emceed a January 1962 meeting where folks listened to a telephone speech given by General Edwin Walker. He was blamed for fear-mongering while echoing Gerald L.K. Smith by stating that Congolese troops were training in Georgia, the United States. Jackman and his ilk believed the UN would occupy the US, thinking Kennedy favored arms control and disarmament, and that would strip the US of military might. And in April 1963, Jackman spoke at the Congress of Freedom meeting in New Orleans. advocating violence as the way forward. At this meeting, attended by Joseph Milteer and Willie Somerset, assassination plots were hatched. Multiple assassination plots were hatched against political figures and prominent citizens in the U.S., but not against the president. I need to be clear on that. I think that might be seen as a mistake, or they might be seen as evidence for the plot against the president in Dallas, but it's not. This meeting illustrates rather shockingly how serious paramilitary faction of the right was willing to go. In a letter, General Pedro del Valle recommended Jackman provide the names of those targets put forward at the Congress of Freedom meeting to General Edwin Walker. It's beyond the scope of what I'm talking about here, but General Walker and Del Valle constitute a band of what I call watchful protectors for the Klan. Um, we have been discussing here through a loose federation of hard radical right wingers of the Chickshinny Knights. I mentioned this before. I've written about the Chickshinny Knights, also known as the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem, in which the same mentality of fascist Christian identity, anti-Semitism, Christian nationalism, and U.S. isolation was advocated while while fronting as a legitimate Catholic order of knights. This paramilitary quasi-chivalric order cannot be overstated. At the time of President Kennedy's death, this Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem membership was laden with right-wing individuals, including this quote-unquote quasi-chivalric order had an armed services committee, and that consisted of these same generals and officers who once served under General Douglas MacArthur. And let's name these names. They are General Charles Willoughby, dubbed by MacArthur as my little fascist, General Pedro del Valle, General Lemuel C. Shepard, General George Stratemeyer, General Bonner Fellers, Colonel William Potter Gale, and Colonel Philip Corso, who I mentioned earlier, was the one who was putting forth the false information that Oswald was a paid FBI informant. And although he was not under MacArthur, we can put General Edwin Walker in there as well. He was made a member of this order's Military Affairs Committee in 1965. Now, I was dubious of these generals involved in this order. My research sometimes would lead down these dead ends that orders would name an individual as being part of their organization, but it was really just name dropping, and this person had no idea that they were part of this organization. So I reached out to the current Grand Master of this order, Barry Garland, OSJ, and asked if these generals were in fact active members. And here's his reply. MacArthur's staff had active Knights of St. John. MacArthur always hired these types of active intelligence specialists. Potter Gale and Willoughby were a couple that I remember offhand. The OSJ never fielded teams from the USA. Those knights were mostly killed in combat during the Russian Civil War. The few who survived are named in our online history. Major General Del Valle was active at the same time as Willoughby, and both did anti-communist work out of Florida. Since the Bolshevik War, the OSJ has been mainly engaged in a traditional military/intelligence mission, unlike the many order offshoots, which since 1798 have embraced solely charitable endeavors. What is Garland saying here? While referencing the other St. John orders that function, primarily as quasi-NGOs, focusing on charity work and social services, this Grand Master seems to be suggesting that the Sovereign Order of St. John of Jerusalem was carrying on the traditions of the Crusade era knights, like the Knights Templar. To me, this had enormous implications. One of General Willoughby's proteges was Reverend Billy James Hargis of Tulsa, fundraiser, ardent follower of the John Birch Society, chaplain of the Constitution Party, who I suspect O.B. Graham was also affiliated with. In September 1961, Hargis announced quote, that a secret fraternity to coordinate right-wing activities would soon be formed. This is a quote from Dick Russell's The Man Who Knew Too Much. This group, secret fraternity, became known as the Anti-Communist Liaison and met for the first time in March 1962. Knight and Army Lieutenant Colonel and Reverend William Potter Gale took the goals of the Anti-Communist Liaison to heart by organizing a paramilitary unit, the California Rangers. He wrote a tactical guide. He urged that patriotic underground army should be established, named the Rangers, who should train to assassinate, sabotage, and overthrow the people's democracy. And that's quoting Peter Dale Scott. These guys were essentially warning that under the Kennedy administration, a communist takeover, as I mentioned already, was imminent in their mind, whether by Soviet invasion, UN control, or a treasonous president, a closet commie. And what was the solution then? Limited government, nothing above the county level, with unfettered use of firearms, and no prohibition on the Bible and the Constitution as the two references to American life. I mentioned William Potter Gale. He is very important. Potter Gale was in Southern California, and he was an ordained reverend by none other than Wesley Swift in Swift's church, the Church of Jesus Christ Christian. Both were advocates of the serpent seed theology. And out of all the names mentioned here, and there are a lot of names, Potter Gale and Wesley Swift are my top suspects for project managing the JFK assassination. Indeed, Harry Dean said Potter Gale was a fundraiser for the assassination. So through Gale, Potter Gale, and Wesley Swift, we can now meet individuals known to be on the ground in Dealey Plaza, not just Joseph Milteer, on November 22nd, as well as others who were kind of hovering around events of that day. For instance, Edgar Eugene Bradley, he was another Southern California preacher. He was identified by Dallas County Deputy Sheriff Roger Craig in an affidavit Craig was saying that Bradley was impersonating a Secret Service agent in front of the Texas School Book Depository on the 22nd. Bradley not only was influenced by the teachings of Wesley Swift, and by the way, Swift prophesied in January 1963 that something was going to happen to JFK that year. And 6 weeks before the actual assassination, he's on tape saying Kennedy is entering a critical period. But Bradley was also linked to William Potter Gale. Both Gale and Swift presided over an October 1963 meeting of the Christian Knights of the Invisible Empire, where 38 members were inducted into the Klan. This was part of Swift's four-front structure. The first front was the church itself, the Church of Jesus Christ Christian. The second front was certain members were recruited to be part of what was called the Awake movement. The third front was the recruitment of more militant-leaning members to join the Christian Knights of the Invisible Empire. The most militant-minded of that group then would be part of the inner den, the ones who would actually go out and commit actual acts of violence. It's interesting that both Swift and Potter Gale came to a head with each other a month after the assassination, and the two actually split. And amazingly, an FBI report from Miami says that William Potter Gale was responsible for the Birmingham church bombing of September 15th, 1963, that killed the four little black girls. Somersett filed information with the Bureau after attending a Constitutional Party of America meeting that Gale was headed to Florida to stir up trouble. This is fall of 1963. Now remember, JFK was in Miami on November 18th. His motorcade was canceled in that city due to Willie Somersett's recording of Milteer predicting the assassination. Where does Officer J.D. Tippit fit in? We are fixing to go in and shake it down. Sergeant Gerald Hill of the Dallas Police broadcasted a little after 1:41 p.m. on November 22nd, referring to the Abundant Life Temple. Before anyone could shake it down, however, the police were called to the Texas Theater, where Lee Oswald was quickly arrested during a screening of the Korean War film War is Hell and taken into custody. It's worth noting that, according to a 2013 Dallas magazine article, J.D. Tippit evidently worked at the Texas Theater as an off-duty officer. Thanks to research by John Collins, R.E. Davis was known to plant Klansmen to infiltrate the Dallas police. Could this have been J.D. Tippit? Tippit certainly knew those in the right-wing milieu. He was a part-time bouncer at Austin's Barbecue, which was a known meeting place for the John Birch Society. Based on the seemingly spurious activities of Tippit in the frenzied minutes of his life, final minutes of his life, it is not out of the realm of possibility to consider that if Willie Somerset was correct, Tippit's job was to probably kill Lee Harvey Oswald and advance the cover story. The Kennedy assassin was quickly put down by the able and responsible Dallas PD. But something went awry. Maybe Oswald got privy to what was unfolding, if it was Oswald at all. In the scenario of the conspiracy, perhaps, Oswald was never supposed to be taken alive. On the other hand, pinning both JFK and Tippit's murder made him seem overwhelmingly guilty. And in many ways, that continues to this day. But the location of that rendezvous that ended in Tippit, who was 39, being shot 4 times, is telling, given everything we have discussed here. But what of the suspect that was seen running into the Abundant Life Temple? The encounter between Tippit and his murderer strangely evokes an incident involving Wesley Swift 30 years earlier. A group of kidnappers seemed to be stalking Swift and his young wife in 1932. According to the LA Times, Swift's mother was threatened by the gang outside the Angelus Temple. Swift's mother escaped her assailants by rushing inside the church, shaking off her potential kidnappers. So to recap, it just happened to be a Pentecostal house of worship run by a former Civil Air Patrol chaplain, O.B. Graham, who is tied to Voice of Healing revivalists like O.L. Jaggers, Gordon Lindsay, William Branham, Oral Roberts in Tulsa, and ultimately Roy E. Davis, one of the 3 shooters, according to Willie Somerset, in Dealey Plaza. By the way, this whole aspect was left so unchecked, it paved the way for Reverend Jim Jones of Jonestown. Jones and Jaggers held revivals for a short time together in the early 1950s, among other links with the same men. I mean, Jones was really a follower of Branham, and now all of this opens the door to Jack Ruby. The morning of the assassination, Ruby saw the "Welcome Mr. Kennedy to Dallas" advertisement printed in the Dallas Morning News. He was actually at the Dallas Morning News offices placing his own ad, which he was known to do. I think at the end of every week or at the end of every other week, he would be putting ads in. So he's there at the newspaper office, and he's looking at this advertisement. It was a sarcastic welcoming. He didn't realize that at first. He thought it was an actual, like a nice welcome to the president. The text was rife with derogation. Ruby noticed the ad was sponsored by a Jew, Bernard Weissman. Now, Ruby, of course, was born Jacob Rubenstein in Chicago. He thought the ad was insulting to both Jews and President Kennedy. Ruby, at this point now, becomes obsessed with the ad as that day wore on. The assassination happened not too long after that morning, early afternoon, 12:30. So Ruby becomes obsessed with the ad, and especially as news was constantly unfolding about how things happened, who was picked up, and other oddities from that day. Later, it'll be determined that those who paid for the ad, all tied to the John Birch Society, and General Edwin Walker, Dallas resident, and his network of right-wing extremists. I think we need to mention here the Walker connection cannot be overlooked. Walker, as I mentioned, he was a disgruntled former Army general who lived in Dallas. He's a Texas native. In April of 1963, Lee Oswald supposedly takes a shot at General Walker while General Walker is doing his taxes at his home. And he just happened to be leaning in or something, and the bullet went right past. Um, and there's a lot of questions about what exactly happened and who actually did that. But the fact that it involves Walker is so early on, 7 months before the assassination, it's another one of those suspicious things where you wonder how much of this was actually staged, given everything else that I've put forth about Walker and his associates. All right, so the fact of the ad reminded Ruby of a similar ad known as the Impeach Earl Warren billboard, which was adjacent off Stemmons Freeway. That was also sponsored by the John Birch Society. It was later determined that Ruby was at Parkland Hospital right after the assassination. In the afternoon, he closed his nightclub for the weekend out of mourning and respect. That's what he says. That evening, he's at his sister's apartment. It's about 6 o'clock, and he throws up. That night at 9:30, he goes to a memorial service at Shearith Israel Synagogue. Then he took sandwiches from a deli to Dallas Police Headquarters and remained on site. So he was there for the Kafkaesque press conference featuring Lee Oswald, who denied any wrongdoing. Ruby brought sandwiches to then the newsroom at KLIF Radio. With him was a copy of H.L. Hunt's Lifelines radio script, which he had weeks earlier from a trade show. Ruby told a buddy of his, Russ Knight, that Dallas radicals probably had something to do with the assassination. H.L. Hunt, well, H.L. Hunt deserves his own recording. It's suffice to say, if there was an old oil man from Dallas who could protect the conspirators, it was H.L. Hunt. Now, it's 4 a.m. Ruby and two buddies, George Senator and Larry Crawford, take a Polaroid camera, and they drove to inspect this Impeach Earl Warren billboard off the Stemmons Freeway. Ruby suspected the P.O. box on that ad was the same one as the Welcome Mr. Kennedy ad. They were slightly different, but his suspicion was correct. It was the John Birch Society, in fact, sponsored that billboard. Now, the owner of Box 1757, I believe, is being presented for the first time. Take a look. This is from the El Paso Herald Post, February 17th, 1961. At this time, and the time of the assassination, Roy E. Davis and his wife, Allie Lee, were living at 3311 Glen Haven Boulevard in Dallas, about 3.5 miles from where J.D. Tippit was gunned down in Oak Cliff. By the way, Mrs. R. Davis, Allie Lee, was the same woman who years earlier Davis was arrested for on charges for underage sexual contact. Allie was 17, 40 years younger than R.E. Davis. R.E. Davis had a huge rap sheet. I mean, this guy was... So, JFK was wanted for treason, and Earl Warren was wanted for impeachment, and Roy E. Davis was behind both of those posters. Why did the John Birch Society hate Earl Warren so much? He was the Chief Justice who presided over the 1954 decision, Brown versus Board of Education. Sunday morning now, after Jack Ruby is arrested for shooting Oswald in the abdomen at Dallas Police Headquarters, Joseph Milteer is in South Carolina and he is a happy man. When he finds out about that, he says, quote, "That makes everything perfect now. The Jews killed Kennedy and the Jews killed Oswald. Now we have no worry." It was the plan. The next phase of this plot was for Milteer and his Klan friends to make sure that the Jews were the ones to be blamed for the assassination of the president. All right, two last things. Why would white Christian ministers and fellow Catholics want to kill JFK? The fact that Kennedy was Catholic is integral to his assassination, in my opinion. It cannot be separated. It is not a coincidence. Remember, there were three targets in the Klan crosshairs: Blacks, Jews, and Catholics. Protestant Americans were wary of the first Catholic elected to higher office in the U.S. because they felt his allegiance would be to another head of state, the Pope, before putting the people of the U.S. first. Now, on the other hand, Kennedy's presidency occurred during the massive meeting of Catholic bishops in Rome, the Second Vatican Ecumenical Council, to enact a set of reforms to update the church for the modern world. It was convened by John the 23rd, who dies in 1963, in the summer of 1963, and it's finished by Pope Paul VI. All the Catholic bishops around the world were in Rome in one of these sessions for the council when the president was killed in Dallas. Like today, some bishops were more progressive than others. The Archdiocese of New Orleans, for instance, supported the Kennedy administration, as we know, of integration. More conservative Catholics at the time, like Delphine Roberts, Leander Perez, Jackson Rakow, did not. Whatever the motivations, ultimately, of these tragic figures, white supremacy continued and continues to fester. Recognizing its role in the assassination of the president will be a cathartic step in healing our country of its greatest sin.